So before I start, I'm going to tell you how we are going to finish. I'll give you a glimpse of how documentation is managed in a large open source community, the WordPress community. I'll give you a few tips and make a couple of strong points on the importance of documenting everything. If you haven't been documenting anything before, you'll agree and find it quite relatable because I'm skilled in making strong points and I have some really good names. And you'll even ask a few questions or start reading some of the pages I recommend. You'll start making plans in your head how from now on everything you work on will be documented. And tomorrow you'll go back to old non-documentation life. Unless you are already a member of an open source community or considering becoming one, and there's no handbook on how to be a member of that community, or you're trying to use open source software in your project, but the latest version in documentation is 3 major versions ago, or you are developing this magnificent software and you made it open source and set the license to allow everyone to use it, but it just doesn't get any contributions from random good people as it should. I mean, it's open source for Christine's sake. So now that we have established who this presentation is for, I hope the rest of you will want to take up on one of these roles by the end of the presentation itself. Being a part of an open source community is both liberating and enslaving at the same time. You're gonna love it. But first, I want to address a few misconceptions regarding documentation itself. So this one is pretty common. Code should be self-documented. And this kind of thinking is really rather elitistic and creates a community in a bubble. You're inviting only developers and only those developers who understand your code and the structure of your project. You're really inviting yourself. And you are missing out on different use cases and new feature proposals and new contributors. So many new contributors. You are limiting the growth of your project in every possible way. The next one, it's obvious how to use our software. Users will know. This one is so funny and so not true. Even if your software is yet another email client, there will always be enough new users who will not know how to navigate it or will not use it properly. And being a developer and documentarian, this is probably my favorite. Real developers write code and have no time for docs. Now, if you tried to write docs, you'd know just how in-depth you need to understand software and how many skills you need to be able to pass that knowledge. And once you try and realize this, you'll know for a fact that only real developers can write software developer docs. Besides, writing documentation is like exercising. Everybody should do it for at least half an hour a day. But if you really don't have that time, you should do it for an hour a day. And these are just few of many. We don't have time for all misconceptions. And of course, there are many challenges when you decide to write documentation. It's never finished. And you really need to commit to it. But this is how world looks like without documentation. Now, this user obviously knows how to use this device, right? But regardless of how many people are happy without documentation, there will always be those few, those never happy, always wanting more, and they will write it vigorously. Anyway, open source communities. So my first encounter with WordPress was in September 2009, and my first contribution to its documentation was a year and a half later on May 12th, 2011. Besides many tutorials found online, from the very beginning, I was using the existing docs to assist my reckless development in local environment. But then I found some features and behaviors in my local WordPress which weren't documented. Me, being a hold my beer type of person, couldn't stand this kind of oversight, so I documented it. But it was so easy to contribute in 2011. Early WordPress documentation, also known as Codex, is built on Wiki, and that has both good and bad sides. This means that anyone with WordPress.org account can edit any page. All you need is this one account at WordPress.org. And there is even a history of edits, so you know exactly what happened and when. So even a small piece of documentation from each member will build a great documentation in no time, right? And when you think of it, Wiki does sound like a perfect tool for collaborating on open source documentation. The only problem with this is that everyone with a WordPress.org account can edit any page. Can you imagine everyone with a WordPress.org account being able to edit any page? Project grew, gained more attention, and more spam. It's a maintenance nightmare. The solution was having more control over who has access to it. So the tool had to be changed. And really, what's a better tool than the one we were building, WordPress, right? So migration of content was set in motion. The first heavy load was differentiating end user documentation from developers documentation, making sort of catalogs and then start moving it. And by moving, I mean copy pasting manually. Many Google spreadsheets, and few years later, it was completed, almost. But by fixing this one problem, which is spam and unwanted edits, another problem was created. It wasn't easy to contribute anymore. And when it's not easy to contribute, people stop contributing. Well, not me. When I realized there was documentation I couldn't edit anymore, I dug deeper to find out who did this. And I found this group of people who call themselves WordPress documentation team, and they were making all these decisions about how documentation is going to look like and who can change it. Well, I like making decisions too, so I joined them in September 2016. So now, in order to contribute, because you need a WordPress.org account, but you also need WordPress Slack account to communicate with documentation team. And you need access to WordPress dashboard where documentation is written, which can be granted by documentation team and few more people with higher access. And while we want to encourage people to contribute, we have to be mindful of the unwanted edits and possible mistakes because that's the problem we wanted to fix. So granting access is really a fine line and definitely a bottleneck. But that's not all. This new workflow created a need for a place where people can report issues with documentation. These kinds of changes in community dynamics require the ability to scale, to recognize the problem, flexibility to adapt quickly, all of which we didn't do for a long time. So besides the need for these two accounts, WordPress.org and Slack, potential contributors now need to know where and how to report the issues they found. And this is a good moment to introduce you to different parts of WordPress documentation. Now, the best thing you can do when leading the team, especially open source team, is to delegate responsibilities. So all these projects you're going to see have their own representatives or project leads. These are people who report on progress for each project on our weekly meetings. And also, if you have any question about the project or you want to get involved, you would go directly to them. They have the freedom in choosing tools they are using for managing this project. So we ended up with different workflow and for reporting and fixing issues for almost every project we have. So here we go. End user documentation. It is also called Help Hub internally, and it's located next to support forums, which is the place where end user would go to ask for help. It's split in two parts. We have general documentation and block editor end user documentation. There is no visible difference between the two except that block editor article will have changelog at the bottom of the page. But the real difference is behind the scenes, people who maintain it and the tools they use. So general end user documentation is created mostly in Google Docs uh, because anyone can have access there. And below each article, and when it's created there, then we paste it to WordPress editor. And below each article is text area. It is intended to be used for reporting issues and giving feedback about that article. The problem here is that people use this text area for different things, such as asking questions about how to use WordPress. So these questions should be posted in support forums. Also, we get a nice share of spam. So we need a person who is going to triage all the feedback and separate the actual issues from everything else. But mainly how issues are reported for end user documentation is in our Slack channel, because that's what's easiest for people. Progress and task management for this project is mainly done in Google Spreadsheets. Now, being on the same WordPress install, block editor and user documentation is created the same way as general docs is in Google Documents. They're also using the same feedback text area, and also most of the issues are reported in Slack. However, block editor's development is extremely fast comparing to the rest of WordPress. Release cycles are 2 weeks long, and end user documentation is trying to follow this tempo. They're using Google Docs for collecting release changes and Trello board for managing work on documenting these changes. And because WordPress is using both GitHub and SVN for development and issue tracking, this team is spending a lot of time going through all these tickets as well. Developer documentation is also known as DevHub internally. It is located at developer.wordpress.org and consists of 8 different handbooks at the moment, but we are looking at a new one very soon. 5 of these are maintained by documentation team. Code reference is a specific handbook because the large part of it is generated from the code itself. There is a script that goes through all core files, collects every function, class, and hook, except for dynamic hooks, and creates a page in WordPress for it. So description, parameters, changelog, what it returns, where it is used, since when it exists, and similar info is also extracted from code or from code comments, as we call it, inline documentation. However, this is only for PHP code. We still don't have this kind of documentation for JavaScript part of WordPress, even though I know that there's been some work done on that kind of script. So the other parts of these pages that are not generated from the code, such as additional info and user-contributed notes, are created directly in WordPress. Additional info is managed from dashboard by documentation team, and user-contributed notes are using commenting system. Since these are mostly code examples, they are held for review by the documentation team. So this handbook is really a hybrid type, and reporting issue for it, now here comes the fun part, depends on which part of the page you found the issue. So if it's the part generated from code, you have to open track ticket as you would with any issue with the code itself. But if the issue is with parts managed from WordPress, then you should report it in our Slack channel. And this is a good moment to ask yourself, if someone was just reading the page and find the issue with it, how do they know which part is created where, and more importantly, why would they care? Anyway, block editor, also known as Gutenberg, is the newest bigger project in WordPress, and that can be seen in tools the team is using, such as Webpack or Grunt, which can be found in older WordPress projects. Documentation itself is created in the same GitHub repository by using Markdown files, which are then parsed into WordPress pages with another script. We love those scripts. Reporting issues with this part of documentation is done in GitHub repository, so it's pretty much clean and straightforward, right? And the remaining 3, common APIs, themes, and plugins handbook, are managed the same way as general end user documentation. So it's created directly in WordPress dashboard, and the issues are usually reported in Slack channel. We do plan to add the same feedback text area there, just the same as we have it for end user documentation. And contributor docs. So documentation team has its own handbook. Actually, each team that is making WordPress has their own blog and handbook for contributors and team members. All of this is located at make.wordpress.org. Each team has regular meetings, and the blog is a place for meeting agendas and summaries, while handbooks are used for explaining what the team is working on, who are the members, and how to get involved. So it's a place for documenting contribution processes. And yeah, those are all the parts of WordPress documentation. And that's how you would report any issue with it. Now, I know how to report these issues only because I have repeated this so many times to everyone who showed the slightest interest in getting involved. And I got from them this face you are seeing right now, which is somehow understandable. And when repetition became too much, we wrote it down in our handbook, even recorded videos. But even then, we've been getting feedback how difficult and confusing it is to get involved with documentation team. Again, we needed to rethink our tools, but with a different set of criteria this time. So the perfect tool doesn't exist yet, but here are some parameters to consider when choosing one. Ideally, people should be able to report the issue on the spot without ever leaving the page or being required to do anything else, such as creating a new account, searching through some other platform, or reading guidelines about where and how to report the issue. And there are two types of contributors reporting the issues: those who report it and move along, and those who report it and wants to fix it. Those who just want to report it should never, ever know the workflow between the place where the issue is found and the place where issue is fixed. We should never ask them to do anything more. And while we really want to make it easy for people to report the issue, we don't want to make additional work for active contributors who are going to fix those issues. So when issues are reported in Slack channel, that's additional work for team members because someone needs to make sure that report doesn't get lost in Slack noise by either copying it somewhere else or fixing it right away. Also, if the tool or the workflow is complicated, there's additional work for experienced contributors to explain it to every new contributor, unless you document your process and keep that documentation up to date religiously. And even then, workflow should never really be complicated. We are giving our free time and we should enjoy that, not making complicated workflows and things to do. So the next thing is automate everything. This is really a no-brainer. Anything that can be automated, anything that you're going to do more than once should be automated. And open source projects have a lot of things that can be automated, but really, all that comes down to getting enough, but not too many, notifications at the right time and the right place about exactly what needs to be done and where. And as I said, perfect tool doesn't exist yet. So we join more teams at WordPress that have the same needs. Those teams are marketing, training, learning, and we are going to try to build it for WordPress.org. Now, this is work in progress, so I can't say more at the moment, but we are all very, very excited. Meanwhile, we decided to use GitHub as a central place for reporting all documentation issues until our custom perfect tool is ready. Now, there are several arguments behind this decision, even though this is yet another account for contributors that they need in order to contribute. We have removed the burden of having to know workflow for reporting issues. And in the future, we hope to use the custom integration with GitHub, where people will be able to report issues on the spot And GitHub API will automatically open new issue, label them properly, and send all the necessary notifications. Now, contributors who want to fix issues don't have to decide in GitHub which part of documentation they want to work with. They can just go there to issues, find what they like, and start working on it. And in the future, we hope to move as much as possible documentation to GitHub, which would remove the maintenance bottleneck with granting access and provide proper version control. Also, in WordPress community, we like to give credits to people for every contribution, even the smallest one. But when contribution is done in Slack, either by reporting the issues and passing by or just by participating in discussion, it's hard to catch all the usernames and thank all the people properly. With GitHub as a place for reporting, discussing, and assigning issues, we hope to finally be able to track all contributors and their contributions. And when we talk about WordPress documentation, we cannot skip Gutenberg. This is a living example of how lack of proper documentation can slow down the progress of open source projects. For those of you who don't know, Gutenberg is a new editing experience for WordPress. Well, not so new anymore, but it is still being avoided by many developers and site builders. At the beginning, it was replacing what you see is what you get editor, and more recently, it is expanding to a full site editing experience. So, what is the problem with Gutenberg? Gutenberg is based on React, but not just that. There is the PHP layer of WordPress as we know it, and the React layer as a base of Gutenberg. But there is also a mixed PHP and React layer of Gutenberg. And in order to document it, we need people who understand all three layers in depth. But those people are rare, and they were too busy writing the code. So we let Gutenberg be merged into core and published without documentation being adapted for PHP developers, which is the majority of WordPress developers. Of course, this resulted in frustrated users who refused to use Gutenberg. And, in WordPress, it's common practice. When something is new, someone will write a plugin to undo the change. We are used to that. But this was much bigger. This change provoked even forking of pre-Gutenberg WordPress. So when you have this large change in code base and this strong rejection by your users, you inevitably create two streams. One stream is keep working on code because it's large, it's already there. So they try to make it better, more attractive, more useful, more acceptable. But the other stream keeps rejecting it because they have no place to learn from. But they are also seeing more progress and realizing just how much more they are behind each day. So the frustration grows. Less and less people are capable of writing documentation for it, and then we face documentation depth. So how do you move from here? How do you fix this? Well, slowly. We are trying to find the middle ground, to find people who understand React, people who understand WordPress and PHP, and bit by bit, by communication, by asking questions and answering them, and asking again more questions and answering them, we are trying to fill what is missing there. And however weird it may sound, the best documentation is written by those who are using it. And this is true for all documentation. Let people go through it and point to places where it stops making sense. Give them the missing information, and if they are not too frustrated, they might fill in the gaps. And you have converted a documentation user into a documentation writer. Congratulations. And so you see, it's not perfect, far from it. WordPress as a project grew faster than we even realized that we need to adapt. There was this time when different teams could do their jobs separately, but now, actually, for a while now, we see our needs overlapping. We feel the necessity to communicate more, to share tools and workflows. And I think this state is partly due to our inertia. We join an open source project, learn how to be a good member, and try to keep it working the way it did before. But it can be scary to propose something new to a project as large as WordPress is. WordPress is covering over 40% of internet. There is a specific kind of pressure in keeping that in mind, not to mention how slow decisions are made. The bigger project, the slower move it. Sometimes we need months before we make a decision. But the documentation team is trying to move things forward. And this is what we are doing at the moment. So two WordPress documentation projects were selected for Google Season of Docs in 2020. And during this time, we collaborated with technical writers who helped us create official documentation style guide and improve end user docs. We are happy that these technical writers loved our community and decided to stay as active contributors. Now, it might be hard to believe, but the documentation team was never really involved in WordPress releases. I was loudly unhappy about it. So I took documentation focused lead role for a WordPress 5.8 release in order to learn the process and see how the documentation team can be more involved in the future. Also, we are working together with other teams, learning, training, marketing, to build this perfect tool for keeping up with changes in WordPress releases, simplifying contributing processes while automating everything that can be automated. And I'm really excited about this one. We're trying to start a new workflow where every developer working on code, especially the new feature, will have a dedicated documentarian who follow along, ask questions, and document everything while it's being developed. We want to stop releasing code without documentation. And of course, at the moment, we don't have enough people for that. But we hope that the fact you'll be working closely with experienced developers would attract more contributors in near future. Also, always, always document processes because the buzz factor is real and transparency and documentation are the only ways to keep open source alive. And keep in mind, there is no documentation on how to do things when open source project expands in this capacity and time frame. We are the ones who have to rethink workflows and tools, who have to make faster decisions based on ever-changing requirements we come across. We have to stop reacting and start leading the open source evolution. And we are the ones who have to document all this for the future projects. If you want to learn more about open source and documentation, I can highly recommend these resources. And I would like to invite you to join WordPress community at make.wordpress.org. I personally am always offering cookies for docs contributors, and that's a true story. My name is Milana Cap. I'm freelance developer at TopTal and one of representatives for the WordPress documentation team. It has been a great pleasure to be here, and I hope you'll discover and embrace those inner documentarians of yours. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Milana. There's quite some very impressive work being done on the documentation at WordPress. That's something that I've learned today. We don't have a lot of time for questions, but I saw one question that I think is very interesting. Mike asks, how do you make developers more enthusiastic about writing documentation? How do you convince them?
Well, I found that when they come to us and ask how to do things, and it's not written uh, in current documentation, then we start, if we know how to do that, then we help them a little bit and ask them if they could provide us some, well, they could start working on that, find out, and then provide us with updated documentation. So basically, developers get excited when they learn something that is not written anywhere, they can find anywhere, and they want to share it. So they can write it in their blog, or they're going to share it on Twitter, or we can ask them, and be very nice and offer cookies, and we can ask them to share that with us and contribute to documentation.